Have you ever wondered how far one soul can go to protect another? In the forgotten corners of a storm-washed town, a little girl whispered, "Don't let them take me back." No one knew who brought her to the hospital. No one knew what she'd survived, but one officer and his loyal German shepherd were about to uncover the truth hiding in the shadows. What they found would shake the entire town. Where are you watching from today? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. And no matter what storm you're walking through, I hope this story brings a little light. Have a beautiful day. The storm had rolled in over Ashford like a siege, a curtain of rain hammering the rooftops of the small industrial town and pooling in dark rivers along the curbs. Street lamps buzzed in defiance, their amber glow blurred into halos by the downpour. Storefronts were shuttered, neon signs flickering weakly against the black canvas of night. And the old brick mill that stood on the edge of town looked like a ghostly silhouette swallowed by lightning. On the deserted main avenue, a police cruiser cut through the rain, its wipers slapping furiously, headlights knifing the gloom. Behind the wheel sat Ethan Cole, a 35-year-old police officer whose life had become as weathered and stoic as the storm that cloaked the city. Ethan was tall, nearly 6'2", his frame lean, but built from years of pursuit, discipline, and training. His short-cropped hair, dark brown with flecks of premature gray at the temples, was damp from where his cap had failed to keep the water out earlier. His square jaw carried the faint shadow of stubble, not from carelessness, but from long hours on duty that left little time for vanity. His eyes were a striking shade of gray-blue, the kind that seemed to absorb the world's weight and reflect back a guarded resilience. To his colleagues, Ethan was respected for his quiet strength, his reliability in moments when others faltered. Yet underneath, there lingered the shadows of a past that had reshaped him. His wife's sudden departure 3 years ago had hollowed something inside him, teaching him that life had a habit of turning without warning, leaving you to carry what remained. Duty had filled the silence she left, and so did the partnership of the creature now seated beside him. On the passenger seat sat Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd, his thick coat a tapestry of black and silver that gleamed even in the dim interior light of the cruiser. Ranger's build was powerful and elegant, broad shoulders tapering into a lean frame, a posture that spoke of both loyalty and readiness. His amber eyes, sharp and intelligent, flicked between the rain-streaked windows, catching movement others would miss. Once trained as a K9 service dog, Ranger had been reassigned after an injury sidelined him temporarily. Ethan had taken him in, not just as a partner, but as a lifeline. The bond between them had grown into something unspoken, yet fierce. Each depended on the other in ways words could not capture. Ranger was not simply an animal to Ethan. He was a shield, a sentinel, and a reminder that loyalty still existed in a world where so much had been stripped away. Ashford itself was a place defined by contrasts. Once thriving as a mill town, the collapse of industry had left many of its neighborhoods sagging under the weight of poverty. Old brick apartments leaned with exhaustion, paint peeled from wooden porches, and bars outnumbered bookstores 3-1. But there was also resilience here, families who clung to one. Another, small diners with warm lights that never shut off, and children who found laughter even in cracked sidewalks. Ethan knew these streets intimately, the good corners and the dangerous ones, the alleys where shadows whispered, and the churches where hope still gathered on Sundays. This night, however, hope felt distant. The radio crackled, piercing the rhythmic thrum of rain on the cruiser's roof. Unit 12, report to St. Mary's Hospital. Juvenile female admitted with severe head trauma. Circumstances unclear. The dispatcher's voice was calm, clipped, professional, but Ethan felt the words strike with urgency. He turned the wheel, the cruiser skidding slightly on the slick asphalt before regaining traction. Ranger stirred, ears pricked, a low whine rising in his throat, as if sensing the gravity. "Easy, boy," Ethan murmured, his voice steady but taut with anticipation. "We'll see what's going on." The streets leading to St. Mary's Hospital curved through Ashford's oldest districts, where rusted fire escapes clung to apartment buildings like skeletal arms. Ethan caught glimpses of lives framed by windows, silhouettes of people huddled in dim kitchens, yellow lights spilling out briefly before being swallowed by rain. He often thought about how many of those stories ended up crossing his desk in one way or another. Domestic calls, theft, overdoses. He knew too well that behind many closed doors lingered fear that never made it past the threshold. Tonight, one such fear had spilled out into the storm, carried in the small, fragile body of a child. By the time Ethan pulled into the hospital lot, the rain had eased only slightly, falling in sheets instead of torrents. The glass front of St. Mary's glowed like a beacon against the night, its red emergency letters glaring defiantly against the black sky. He parked, stepped out into the chill, and felt the sting of cold water soak through his uniform trousers almost immediately. Ranger leapt from the cruiser with practiced grace, his paws splashing against the puddled asphalt, his nose lifting to catch the mingled sense of antiseptic, wet earth, and urgency. Together they strode to the entrance, Ethan's boots heavy on the concrete, Ranger's claws clicking a sharp rhythm at his side. Inside, the hospital lobby buzzed with a quiet intensity. Nurses moved briskly, shoes squeaking on sea-polished linoleum, clipboards tucked under arms, while overhead lights cast the room in an unforgiving glow. Ethan spotted Nurse Karen Whitfield, a woman in her early 40s who had earned a reputation in Ashford for her composure under pressure. Karen was tall and slender, her posture upright, even when exhaustion etched faint lines beneath her cropped dark hair. Her rectangular glasses framed eyes that carried both discipline and compassion. Karen was the kind of nurse who commanded a room not through volume, but through calm certainty, and in a place like St. Mary's, that made her indispensable. She saw Ethan and Ranger approaching and nodded once, briskly, then gestured toward the ER wing. "She's in room 2, Karen said, her voice low but urgent. 5 years old, head trauma. She was brought in alone." Ethan frowned, water dripping from his cap as he removed it. "Alone? No guardian?" Karen shook her head. "Someone must have carried her here, but when we checked the entrance cameras, the child appeared in the arms of a man only briefly. He set her down near the automatic doors and left before staff could stop him. We couldn't identify him." Her eyes flicked to Ranger, whose ears stood tall, his gaze sharp. "Whatever happened, detective, it's bad. She's terrified. Keeps slipping in and out of consciousness." Ethan's chest tightened. "Name?" "Her name is Lila," Karen replied softly. The name struck him with a sudden pang of tenderness, like the fragile bell of a memory that hadn't even been his to hold. He nodded once, then followed Karen down the sterile corridor, Ranger pacing at his side with silent focus. When he entered room 2, the sight stilled his breath. Lila Moore, no more than 5 years old, lay curled on the hospital bed, her small body nearly swallowed by the stark white sheets. Her hair was golden, tangled into wet curls that clung to her pale cheeks. The blood matted along her temple had begun to crust, a dark contrast against her fragile skin. Her face bore the innocence of childhood, but also the shadows of fear that no child should know. She stirred faintly, a whimper escaping her lips, her hands twitching as though reaching for someone who wasn't there. Ethan stepped closer, every movement deliberate, careful not to startle. Ranger settled at the foot of the bed, lowering his great body into a protective crouch, amber eyes never leaving the girl. A nurse adjusted the IV line with quiet efficiency, then left the room, leaving Ethan alone with the child and the hum of machines. He studied her injuries, noting the bruising along her arms, the way her shoulders seemed drawn tight even in unconsciousness. "She didn't get these falling off a swing," Ethan muttered under his breath. The storm outside rattled against the windows as though echoing his thought. He pulled a chair closer, his uniform damp, his boots leaving small puddles against the floor. Ranger shifted closer too, resting his head along the bed frame, his ears flicking back with a low, steady growl, not one of aggression, but of solidarity, as if he understood that here lay someone who needed guarding. Ethan's gaze returned to the child. "Don't worry, kid," he whispered, voice roughened by years of promises broken and rebuilt. "You're not alone anymore." And in that moment, though the storm still raged over Ashford, the first threads of a new story began to weave themselves, threads of protection, truth, and the quiet vow of a man and his German shepherd. Outside, the storm had mellowed to a cold, steady drizzle, but the parking lot of St. Mary's still shimmered under the wet sodium lights like a sheet of trembling glass. Inside, the hospital's sterile corridors were quieter now, a lull between emergencies. The hum of machines, distant pages over the intercom, and the squeak of nurse shoes across linoleum filled the air with a rhythm of practiced urgency. Officer Ethan Cole stood beside the narrow hospital bed in room 2, his posture still as if anchoring himself to the moment. Ranger, his black and silver German shepherd, lay curled beside the base of the bed, head resting between massive paws, amber eyes flicking between every noise and flicker in the room. He hadn't moved since they arrived. Lila Moore, 5 years old, remained unconscious, her breathing shallow and uneven. She lay under layers of crisp hospital linen, dwarfed by the stiff white bedding. A fresh bandage now covered the wound on her temple, but the crusted remnants of blood in her golden curls had yet to be cleaned entirely. Her cheeks were too pale, with dark smudges under her eyes that had nothing to do with sleep. She looked fragile, like a porcelain doll someone had nearly dropped too hard. Ethan hadn't taken his eyes off her for the past 20 minutes. There was a weight pressing on his chest, something deeper than the standard procedural worry. It was the quiet way her small fists had unclenched when Ranger entered the room, the involuntary way her tiny feet had flinched when he spoke above a whisper. These weren't just injuries. They were symptoms of fear made flesh. A soft knock broke the silence. Dr. Miguel Rivera, the attending ER physician, stepped into the room with a clipboard in hand and a brow furrowed in concentration. Dr. Rivera was in his late 30s, medium height with a sturdy frame that filled out his navy scrubs. His skin was warm brown, his black hair cropped close and streaked subtly with gray at the temples. A neatly trimmed beard framed his strong jaw, and his dark eyes radiated a kind of calm intelligence, someone who knew how to think fast but never rushed a decision. His voice was steady, well modulated, the kind of voice that could talk down panic and reassure grieving families without losing credibility. He greeted Ethan with a small nod. "Officer Cole, thanks for waiting." Ethan stepped aside as Rivera approached the bed. "Any updates?" "She's stable for now," Rivera said, flipping through the notes. "There's a mild concussion and superficial bruising, but no skull fracture. What concerns me more are the bruises on her torso and upper arms. They're older, at least a few days." He glanced up, voice sharpening. "This isn't a one-time thing?" Ethan's jaw flexed. "I didn't think it was." He looked down at the child again, heart tightening. "And no idea who brought her in?" Rivera shook his head. "Security pulled. Footage from the ER entrance? She appears for less than 10 seconds. A man carried her in his arms, set her on a bench by the doors, and disappeared. No one got a clear shot of his face. Hoodie, low cap. Could have been anyone." Ranger suddenly lifted his head. The muscles along his back stiffened, and a low growl vibrated from his chest. Ethan followed the dog's gaze to the hallway, where a man had just paused outside the glass door, peering inside. He was in his mid-40s, with slicked-back hair and a damp leather jacket. His jeans were dark and worn, his boots heavy and scuffed. The man's build was thick-set, more from inertia than muscle, and his eyes, set deep under a furrowed brow, darted rapidly from Ranger to Ethan to the child on the bed. His expression wasn't grief, it wasn't concern, it was calculation. Ethan stepped forward, just enough to partially obscure Lila from view. "Can I help you?" The man blinked, startled at being addressed. "No, I thought this was another room." His voice was gravelly, the kind of tone aged by cigarettes and cheap liquor. Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked briskly down the hall, disappearing around a corner. Rivera raised an eyebrow. "Friend of the family?" "I doubt it," Ethan said quietly. "But I'm going to find out." Ranger's tail remained stiff. The growl faded, but his eyes stayed locked on the corridor. Rivera scribbled something onto the clipboard. "I'll keep a nurse stationed here full-time, just in case." "Good," Ethan said. He turned back to the girl, lowering his voice again. "Someone went through a lot of trouble to get her here without being seen. Either they were trying to do the right thing in the wrong way, or they didn't want to be found after." Rivera set the clipboard aside and looked down at Lila. "Whatever it is, she'll need more than medicine to recover from it." Ethan nodded. That's why I'm not leaving her alone." Moments later, Nurse Amanda Lee stepped into the room, nodding to Ethan. Amanda was in her late 20s, short and compact, with a no-nonsense air about her. Her dark blonde hair was tied into a tight bun, and her scrubs bore the faint signs of spilled coffee. She was quick with a chart, quicker with sarcasm, but soft-spoken with children. Amanda had grown up in a foster system and understood the silent terror in kids like Lila. Without a word, she pulled up a chair near the monitor and began taking vitals. Ethan sat down again beside Ranger, one hand on the dog's fur, eyes fixed on Lila's sleeping form. Outside, the rain resumed its quiet rhythm against the windows, but inside, the real storm had just begun. By morning, the rain had tapered into a misting drizzle that floated through Ashford like a ghost refusing to leave. The clouds hung low and colorless, smothering any hint of sunrise. The streets glistened under the gray light, puddles pooling at curb edges and gutters, while chimney smoke curled above rooftops like whispered prayers. Officer Ethan Cole pulled up beside a weather-worn apartment complex nestled between a boarded-up laundromat and a liquor store with broken signage. The building leaned against the morning like a tired man with too many secrets, its bricks cracked, windows patched with tape, and rusted balconies cluttered with plastic chairs, forgotten toys, and soaked blankets. Ethan stepped out of the cruiser and adjusted his jacket collar against the damp. Beside him, Ranger leapt down with practiced ease, his black and silver coat shimmering even under the flat morning light. They stood together for a beat, gazing up at the structure known among patrol units as the Dead End. Not because of the street name, but because too many calls started here and ended nowhere. Apartment 3B was on the second floor. The stairwell creaked under Ethan's weight, and the railings were sticky with grime. He paused outside the door, studying the scratched brass numbers that barely clung to the wood. He knocked once, twice, firm, but not aggressive. No answer. He looked down at Ranger, who sniffed the threshold, then let out a low, steady whine, the same sound he used when approaching wounded animals. Ethan tested the doorknob, unlocked. The door creaked inward. The smell hit first. Stale beer, old sweat, mildew, and something else beneath it all. A sourness that clung to walls like rot. The apartment was dark, the curtains drawn and heavy with moisture. A small kitchen merged with the living space, and what passed for furniture was worn thin. A sagging sofa, a dented metal coffee table, a single chair with one leg bolstered by stacked magazines. On the chipped laminate counter sat a crusted pot and two cracked plates, still smeared with orange residue, macaroni and cheese, the boxed kind. Ethan took a slow breath and stepped inside, careful not to disturb anything. His boots left damp impressions on the linoleum. Ranger moved ahead of him, nose low, body taut. The table had two small bowls placed neatly, one with a pink plastic spoon still in it. Crayons littered the corner. A wrinkled sheet of paper lay half-tucked under a plate. Child's drawing, a crooked house, a stick figure with long yellow hair, a tall one beside it holding hands. Ethan crouched and picked it up gently. He stared at the childish lines for a long moment, then looked at the faint smear of red across the bottom. Blood. Dried. In the corner, by the ragged rug, Ranger barked once, a sharp, clipped sound. Ethan stood and followed the dog's gaze to the wall behind the sofa. There, faintly visible even in low light, were the marks, 3 long smudges running horizontally about waist high. When he turned on his flashlight, the beam revealed the distinct reddish-brown of blood wiped hastily. The living room carpet was stained in patches. One spot, near the baseboard heater, showed signs of heavy impact, fibers flattened, darker than the rest. Ranger sniffed and whimpered. Ethan stepped further in, scanning the hallway. He passed the bathroom, where peeling wallpaper sagged like shedding skin. The sink faucet dripped steadily, each drop echoing with ghost-like cadence. At the end of the hallway was a bedroom, the door slightly ajar. Inside were 2 twin beds. One held a faded purple comforter decorated with unicorns, clearly Lila's. A small stuffed rabbit sat on the pillow, its ear torn and stitched back with blue thread. The other bed had no sheets, just a stained mattress with springs poking through. On the wall above Lila's bed were scribbles in crayon, Stars, suns, a smiley face, but some of them were crossed out, scratched over in angry black lines. He stepped back into the hall. There was a sudden creak behind him, someone shifting above. Ethan froze. The ceiling above him groaned faintly, then fell silent again. He radioed dispatch for a building search warrant and backup. Until then, he had enough to know this wasn't an isolated case of negligence. It was the scene of something systemic. On his way back through the apartment, he paused in the kitchen again. His eyes caught a crumpled note wedged behind the toaster. It was damp but legible. "I'm sorry I left the dishes." He was yelling again. "I had to hide with Lila in the closet. She cried so much. Please come home soon. R." Ethan folded the note carefully and slid it into an evidence bag. Rachel Moore, the mother. Her absence had spoken volumes already. Now it screamed. He heard a door creak down the hallway, the one he hadn't opened. It led to a narrow utility closet, barely the width of a man's shoulders. He swung it open. Inside, against the far wall, was a dented drywall panel about 2 feet high, scuffed and discolored. Ranger sniffed the floor, ears back. That's where they hid. He didn't need confirmation. He felt it. He stood in the center of the living room, rain still tapping faintly on the window. He looked again at the half-eaten meal, the drawing, the stuffed rabbit in the next room. Every detail screamed of survival, not living. Lila had been trying to hold on to something normal in a place designed to crush it. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Nurse Amanda. "She's awake. She asked for someone named Rex." Ethan smiled faintly. "Close enough," he muttered, looking at Ranger. The dog thumped his tail once against the floor, but before he left, he walked to the door, took one last glance back at the quiet ruin of a childhood, then stepped out into the Ashford morning, mist curling around him like secrets not yet told. The fog rolled in from the river that morning, swallowing the alleys and smearing the outlines of buildings like paint left too long in the rain. Ashford wore its exhaustion openly, windows misted over, headlights like dull eyes blinking through the gray. The air was cold and clung to the skin, soaked in a kind of tired silence that felt too thick for a weekday. Officer Ethan Cole sat in his cruiser just outside a weathered corner diner called Lou's Grill, one of the few places in town that still serve breakfast all day and coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. The glass panes were fogged from the inside, and through them he could just barely make out the form of a woman behind the counter, wiping down the same section of laminate with a slow, absent rhythm. Rachel Moore, 34 years old, had once been described in a missing persons report, years ago, back when she was still in high school, as sharp-featured, auburn-haired, 5'7", unusually quiet for a girl with eyes like that. Her eyes were still the same, pale green, flecked with yellow near the center, but the brightness in them had been dimmed by time and tiredness. Her long auburn hair was tied up in a messy bun, streaked now with early gray. The black apron she wore over her dark jeans and red flannel shirt was stained with coffee rings, flour dust, and something that looked like strawberry syrup. Her build was narrow, almost wiry, with a posture slightly hunched, not from age but from habit, like someone perpetually bracing for disappointment. There was once joy in her gait, perhaps, but now every movement seemed rehearsed, careful, preemptively apologetic. Ethan entered the diner, the little bell over the door letting out a single tired chime. The warmth inside clashed with the chill outside, creating a wave of condensation that blurred everything for a second. A few regulars sat hunched in booths, sipping coffee or pushing bacon around plates. A radio played low in the kitchen, static hissing between the notes of an old Willie Nelson track. Rachel glanced up as he approached, her hand slowing over the counter. Recognition flickered in her expression, but not surprise. It was the look of someone who knew, inevitably, the knock would come. "You hear about Lila," she said softly before Ethan could speak. He nodded. "She's at St. Mary's." Rachel's shoulders slumped. She didn't ask how Lila was. She didn't ask what happened. She closed her eyes, turned toward the industrial coffee pot, and poured a cup with slow precision. Her hand trembled slightly. She placed it in front of him without sugar or cream. "I don't have much time. My break's in 10 minutes. Ethan remained standing. "She came in alone. Someone dropped her off and left." "You know who?" Rachel stared at the cup, then shook her head once. No. You sure? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she pulled a napkin from the dispenser and began folding it corner to corner. Her fingers moved with practiced restlessness. You think I don't know what it looks like, she finally said, her voice cracking like ice underfoot. But I didn't leave her. I would never leave her. Ethan softened his tone. Nobody's accusing you, but she's hurt, Rachel, badly. And I walked through your apartment this morning. I saw the blood, the hiding places. The bruises on her arms didn't come from one bad day. That's a pattern. Rachel flinched, dropping the folded napkin. She bent to retrieve it, hands clenched tight. Michael, she whispered. He said it was discipline, that I was too soft, that Lila needed to be tough if she wanted to survive in a place like this. Ethan's jaw tightened. Where is he now? I don't know. He disappears for days, comes back drunk or twitchy. She looked up, fear sharp in her eyes. He's not just violent, Ethan. He's connected. There's people he talks to, people who know things. I've seen him with these men in suits, clean shoes, clean nails. They never talk much, but every time they show up, Michael gets quieter. Then there's more money on the counter the next morning. Not a lot, just enough. Enough to shut me up. That was it. The thread Ethan had been pulling at without realizing. This wasn't just a man losing control in his own home. This was something deeper, organized, intentional. Rachel leaned closer, her voice barely audible. One night, I heard him on the phone. He said something about foster placements, about unclaimed minors. I thought maybe he was just bluffing. But then a girl from down the block vanished last spring. Her mom reported her missing, but nothing came of it. Nobody even followed up. You didn't report any of this? To who? She asked bitterly. He said if I went to the cops, Lila would be the next one to disappear, and not into a hospital this time. Ethan's stomach turned. His fingers tapped against the ceramic coffee cup. Rachel, I'm not just a cop. I'm the one person in this town who's willing to blow this wide open if that's what it takes. But I need you to talk, formally. She looked up again. For the first time, something like hope flickered across her face, but it was crushed almost instantly by the weight of fear. I can't, she said. Not yet. Before Ethan could argue, the back door swung open and a voice barked out. Rachel! Break's over. Move it. Lou Jenkins, the diner owner, stood in the kitchen doorway. In his 60s, overweight with silver hair that looked powdered in flour, Lou had run this place for 30 years. He was known for two things: never firing anyone and never letting anyone slack. His apron was smeared with batter, and his scowl was permanent. Rachel stood up quickly, wiping her hands on her jeans. I have to go. Rachel, Ethan called gently. She paused. Is there anything you haven't told me? She turned back, eyes glistening. Only everything. Then she disappeared into the kitchen. Ethan remained in the booth, staring into his coffee as it cooled. Ranger, who had waited patiently under the table the whole time, let out a single soft huff. The dog was growing restless too. There were too many ghosts circling this case, and not enough names. As Ethan stood to leave, he noticed a man sitting in the corner booth, someone who hadn't been there earlier. He was reading a newspaper, face obscured, but Ethan noted the sharp black shoes, the creased trousers, the untouched coffee. Ranger growled, low and warning. Ethan didn't confront him, not yet. But the storm that had loomed over Ashford last night, it hadn't passed. It was just beginning. Ashford's evening skyline blurred under the returning rain, the kind that didn't fall in dramatic sheets but rather whispered steadily, soaking through coats, past bones, until it felt like the damp lived inside you. The city looked tired beneath the street lamps, alleys slick with sheen, gutters choked with old leaves, and neon signs buzzing like dying fireflies. Ethan Cole adjusted the grip on his flashlight as he stepped through the back lot of an abandoned textile warehouse on the south side of town. His radio was silent, his gun holstered, but the tension in his shoulders said he expected trouble. Ranger padded beside him, nearly invisible in the dim light except for the glint of his amber eyes and the silver on his thick black coat, catching the glow of the security floodlight above the exit door. The warehouse had been shut for years. a casualty of economic collapse and corporate migration, now serving as shelter for squatters, addicts, and, if Ethan's gut was right, something darker. Earlier that afternoon, a tip had come through the anonymous line. If you're looking for the guy who hurt that girl, check behind the old Riverview Mill tonight after dark. He'll be there, he always is, but don't come alone. Ethan didn't bring backup. He brought Ranger. The door creaked open under a little pressure. Inside, the air was damp with mildew and rust, thick with the chemical memory of old machinery. The metal staircase that led to the catwalk groaned with every shift of weight. Crates, broken furniture, and coils of cable littered the floor. Moonlight tried and failed to enter through the filmy, broken skylights overhead. Ranger halted and let out a low, warning growl. Ahead, a shape moved. A man, tall, hunched slightly, pacing slowly near a stack of rusted drums. He was talking to himself, or perhaps to someone not present. His movements were erratic, one hand jerking occasionally toward his jacket pocket, the other clutching a half-empty bottle wrapped in a paper bag. Michael Turner, 42, 6 feet even, with the broad-shouldered frame of a man who'd once known hard labor but had long since traded discipline for self-destruction. His face was weathered, unshaven, with the rawness of wind-chapped skin and the twitchy edge of a man in withdrawal. His black hair was receding and slicked back with rain and sweat, a poorly healed scar cutting through his right eyebrow. His clothes were layered and mismatched, heavy boots, an old army surplus jacket, and ripped jeans, but his hands were clean. Too clean. Ethan stepped into view. "Michael Turner," he called evenly, "we need to talk." Michael didn't flinch at the voice. Instead, he turned slowly, his head cocked like a dog hearing a distant sound. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed in red, but not from alcohol this time. There was something sharper in his gaze, more lucid, more dangerous. "You're the cop," Michael muttered. "The one sniffing around Rachel." "I'm the one protecting her daughter," Ethan corrected. "And right now, I'm trying to give you a chance to explain how a 5-year-old girl ended up in the ER covered in bruises and blood." Michael's face twitched, not with remorse but annoyance. "That little brat ran her mouth too much, always crying. Rachel spoiled her. I was teaching her respect." Ranger growled, sharp and guttural. Ethan didn't need to hold him back. Ranger knew restraint better than most humans, but the sound alone sent a ripple of dread across the cavernous space. Michael laughed, a short, bitter bark. "What's the mutt gonna do? Write me a ticket?" "No," Ethan said calmly. "But I will. You're under suspicion of felony child endangerment, and if half of what Rachel implied is true, maybe conspiracy to traffic minors too." Michael's expression shifted. The corner of his mouth twitched. "She talking now?" "Figures. Can't keep her mouth shut when it matters. Always crying to somebody." "You're done," Ethan said, stepping closer. "You think you're invisible, but you left blood on the walls, Michael. A child hiding in a closet. You made your mess. Now you're going to answer for it." Michael's hand twitched toward his jacket pocket. Ethan's voice dropped. "Don't." But it wasn't a weapon. It was a phone. Michael held it out, screen facing Ethan. A paused video. Ethan's eyes narrowed. The image was grainy, but it looked like a dim hallway. A child's voice echoed faintly from the speaker, crying, pleading. "Where did you get that?" Michael smirked. "You think I was working alone? You think this town's clean?" He shook the phone. "You take me in, I go silent. You leave me alone, I stay gone. The girl never sees me again." Simple Ethan stared at him. "Who else is involved?" Michael shrugged. "People you eat lunch with. People you wave at from your patrol car. Ashford's always had rot in the floorboards, officer. I'm just the one you see." Then he dropped the phone, smashed it under his boot. Ethan moved fast, but not fast enough. Michael darted back through the maze of crates. Ranger lunged forward, chasing the scent, paws thudding against the concrete. They turned the corner, empty. A back door swung slowly on its hinges. The rain outside welcomed Michael's escape like an old friend. Ethan stood in the doorway, breathing hard, the shadows pressing around him. Ranger circled back, ears alert, but tail stiff. They'd lost him. But not the war. Rain clung to the edges of the window panes like the sky was still grieving. Morning broke over Ashford slowly, the kind of gray light that never really becomes day. Everything was drenched, rooftops, sidewalks, the shoulders of early commuters hunched against the wind. But inside room 2 of St. Mary's Hospital, a quieter storm was beginning to break. Ethan Cole sat in the corner of the room, his uniform jacket slung over the back of a chair, his shirt sleeves rolled up past his forearms, revealing a pale scar near his wrist from a training accident long ago. Ranger lay curled beneath the bed, his black and silver coat rising and falling in rhythm with the soft beeps of the heart monitor. The hospital room was warm, too warm, but neither of them moved. They were waiting for a whisper. The little girl on the bed, Lila Moore, stirred again. Her lips parted slightly, her eyes fluttered beneath bruised lids, and then, with a soft, cracked breath, she opened them. Green. Pale green, flecked with light like leaves under morning frost. The same eyes as her mother. Ethan leaned forward gently. "Hey there." She blinked, slow and uncertain. Her voice, when it came, was small, no louder than a thread. "Rex?" Ranger's ears perked. He rose immediately, stepping up beside the bed with the grace of a trained guardian. He laid his chin gently on the mattress, amber eyes locked on the child's. Lila's face twisted in a near smile. "You found me," she whispered. Ethan's throat tightened. "His name's Ranger. But I think he likes Rex too." Lila reached a hand toward the dog's ears. Her fingers trembled but steadied when they sank into his thick fur. She didn't speak for a long time. The machines beeped. Rain tapped the windows. Ranger didn't move. Then she looked up at Ethan. "Is he gone?" Ethan didn't lie. "Not yet." Her tiny shoulders sank. Her lower lip quivered. Then, barely audible, she added, "Don't let them take me back." He reached out, careful not to touch her without permission, but rested his hand on the bed beside hers. "I won't," he said. "I promise. No one's taking you anywhere you don't want to go." The door opened gently behind them. A soft voice asked, "Can I come in?" Ethan turned. The woman at the door was in her late 50s, tall and dignified, with silver-streaked black hair swept into a low braid. She wore a charcoal blazer over a dark maroon blouse, pressed slacks, and low heels. A laminated ID clipped to her chest read, "Monroe, D. Child Protective Services." Dorothy Monroe had worked for the state for over 30 years. Once a foster child herself, she'd become one of the most respected social workers in the Tri-County area. Her reputation wasn't built on efficiency, it was built on trust. Children who didn't speak to anyone else would speak to her. Judges listened when she testified, and abusers feared her name, like a summons. Her face bore the calm lines of someone who'd seen too much but never stopped caring. Her voice carried both kindness and command. She stepped into the room and paused when she saw the dog. "Is this the officer I've been hearing about?" Ethan smiled faintly. "This one's Ranger. I'm the other one." Monroe gave a slight nod. "Of course. I've read your incident reports. Thorough, but restrained." Her eyes settled on Lila. "And this must be Miss Moore." Lila shrank a little, clutching at Ranger's fur. Monroe stopped a few feet short of the bed and crouched slowly, lowering herself to the child's eye level without trying to touch or approach. "That's a beautiful friend you've got there," she said softly. "Did you know he barked so loud the nurses thought a fire alarm had gone off?" Lila blinked. A whisper of a smile touched her lips. Monroe tilted her head. "I'm Dorothy, but you don't have to call me anything unless you want to. I'm here to make sure you feel safe. That's it." Lila didn't respond. Monroe didn't push. She straightened and stepped back. "We'll go slow," she said to Ethan. "Good," he said. "Because we don't have long. Her mother's terrified, and her stepfather just threatened me with silence. Or else." Monroe's eyes narrowed slightly. "Michael Turner. You know him?" "Not directly, but I've heard the name whispered before. In cases that disappear too fast. Transfers that shouldn't have happened. He's not acting alone." Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "That's what Rachel said. She's too scared to file a statement, but she hinted at something. Unclaimed minors, payments under the table, people with clean shoes and cold eyes." Monroe crossed her arms. "We need evidence, reports, paper trails, witnesses. Right now, all we have is fear. Ethan glanced at Lila. She's the only one who saw it all. Monroe looked at the girl again, her expression gentle. Then we protect her like a vault. No one sees her without clearance. No caseworker transfers. No family visits. Not until I say. And Rachel? I'll talk to her, Monroe said. I know that kind of woman, worn thin but not broken. There was a pause. Then Monroe turned to leave. At the door, she looked back. I'm not a miracle worker, Officer Cole, but I'm not afraid of shadows either. Ethan nodded once. Neither am I. Outside the window, the clouds had started to thin. Not sun, not yet. But light. Inside, Lila whispered something again. Ethan leaned close. Can Ranger stay? She asked. He smiled. As long as you want. The Ashford harbor was a graveyard of broken things, rusted cranes, abandoned cargo containers, and shattered pallets that hadn't moved in years. Salt hung in the air, tangled with diesel and decay. The rain had stopped, but a cold wind blew in from the water, sharp enough to sting the skin. Fog clung low along the ground, making every shadow look like it might breathe. Ethan Cole crouched behind a rotting crate near the south loading bay of Pier 7, the last functional structure before the harbor turned to ruin. The tip had come from someone anonymous again, just a few words written in block letters, folded into an envelope dropped under the precinct door. Turner, Pier 7, midnight. Bring proof, not backup. Ethan hadn't told Monroe, not because he didn't trust her, but because this wasn't something he could drag into bureaucracy. Not yet. He'd seen how fast files disappeared when the wrong names were involved. But he wasn't alone. Ranger crouched beside him, ears erect, body tense, amber eyes locked on the thin crack of light bleeding from inside the warehouse. The building's exterior was decaying, steel walls corroded, paint long since stripped by storms and time. Yet someone had been keeping it alive, barely. The light inside wasn't from some overhead bulb left on by accident. It was a bare, hanging work lamp, and beyond its flicker, Ethan could see faint movement, the shifting shadows of men. He moved closer, staying low, breathing through his nose to stay silent. Ranger followed like a ghost. Inside, the warehouse buzzed with activity, but not loudly. This wasn't a drug den or a gang hideout. It was quiet, organized, too organized. There were 3 men inside, not including Michael Turner, who stood near a folding table cluttered with manila envelopes, cheap cell phones, and a laptop. One of the others was tall and bony, in a dark wool coat and gloves, his slicked-back blonde hair giving him a polished corporate look. The second wore a maintenance uniform from Ashford Logistics, though his boots were too clean. The third was older, short, stocky, gray beard trimmed with military precision, holding a clipboard and speaking in low tones. They didn't look like criminals. They looked like men who did business in quiet rooms, with locked drawers and closed blinds. Ethan edged closer to a stack of crates and raised his phone, snapping silent photos. Faces, documents, the laptop screen, even the crate labeled Welfare Transfer, Shelby County. Then he saw it. A folder marked Moore Minor Custody Transfer. Status, unclaimed. His heart seized. They weren't just planning to take Lila, they already had. This was a network. Michael laughed, sharp and thin. Told you the cop's sniffing around. He won't stop. The man in the wool coat spoke for the first time. His voice was flat, like someone discussing weather. Then we remind him why shadows exist. People forget what happens when you look too long into them. The one with the clipboard grunted. If he pushes, we cut the girl loose. No one misses another system kid. Ethan's blood boiled. Ranger shifted beside him, sensing the tension. Ethan whispered, "Wait." But then his elbow nudged a rusted canister. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Every head turned. Lights came up. "Someone's here!" Michael shouted. Ethan didn't wait. He burst from cover, gun raised. "Police! Don't move!" Chaos erupted. The man with the clipboard reached into his coat. Ethan fired once, warning shot into the ceiling. Ranger surged forward, barking thunderously, knocking over a crate as he charged. The men scattered. Michael bolted toward the side door. Ethan chased him while Ranger kept the others pinned near the table, growling, tail rigid. A silent line between order and carnage. Michael crashed through the emergency exit, boots pounding across wet concrete toward the pier. Ethan followed, heart hammering. The wind screamed off the water. Michael reached the edge of the dock, panting, cornered. "You think this ends with me?" he spat. "You think arresting one man changes anything?" "No," Ethan said, breathless. "But it's a start." Michael lunged, not toward escape, but toward Ethan. They collided. Fists flew. Ethan took a hit to the ribs, but caught Michael's jacket and slammed him against the rusted railing. Rain from earlier made everything slick. Michael slipped, nearly fell into the bay, but Ethan grabbed him by the collar and cuffed him hard. Sirens wailed in the distance. Backup finally coming. Back inside, Ranger stood guard over the other two men, who now lay prone on the ground, hands behind their heads. The laptop still glowed. Ethan returned to the table, breathing hard. He opened the folder marked More. Inside, a falsified report listing Lila as abandoned by legal guardian, a forged signature from a Rachel M., and a pre-signed form for placement into a group home 3 counties away. There was no intention of returning her to anyone. Ethan looked at Ranger. "We got it, boy." Ranger let out a soft woof. Justice had begun. Ashford was quiet that morning, not the kind of peaceful silence found in mountain towns or sleepy valleys, but the heavy kind that falls after a storm has shouted itself hoarse. The rain had returned sometime before dawn, soft this time, almost apologetic, as if the sky regretted what it had unleashed the night before. Wet leaves plastered the sidewalks. Police tape flapped in the wind around the old warehouse at Pier 7. Blue and red lights pulsed against the rusted walls, painting them in harsh, alternating warnings of truth and consequence. Officer Ethan Cole stood near the rear of the scene, soaked to the bone, a hand resting on Ranger's sturdy shoulders. His dark patrol jacket was smeared with dirt and sweat, his knuckles raw, but his eyes were clear. The folder marked More Minor Custody Transfer had already been placed into evidence along with the laptop, cell phones, and printed manifests of at least 7 other children whose names didn't belong in those files. Michael Turner sat in the back of a squad car nearby, hands cuffed, his face twisted into something between rage and fear. The 2 other men, the one in the logistics uniform and the one in the wool coat, had been taken into federal custody less than an hour ago. They hadn't spoken. They didn't need to. The evidence spoke louder than words. Detective Laura Sinclair, a woman in her early 40s with a no-nonsense manner and sharp cheekbones, had flown in from the State Bureau overnight. She wore a slim black trench coat, her hair tied in a low bun, and her expression had not changed since the moment she arrived. She reviewed the files in silence, flipping through each page with methodical precision. Her voice was low when she spoke to Ethan. "You did well, Officer Cole." Ethan nodded. This was just one corner of it. Lara looked up. "We'll dig deeper now. Turner and his associates won't be walking free. You stopped something before it became something worse." Beside them, Ranger let out a low chuff, as if agreeing. The sun broke through briefly as the clouds parted over Ashford, casting a faint golden light across the wet pavement. It didn't last, but it was enough. Later that day, at St. Mary's Hospital, Ethan stood outside room 2 once more. Dorothy Monroe had been sitting with Lila most of the morning, reading softly from an old picture book she kept in her tote bag. The child's color had returned, and her bruises, though still visible, no longer looked like they defined her. She laughed once, quietly, when Ranger nudged her with his nose, and that laugh had sent something sharp and warm through Ethan's chest. Rachel Moore was already in the room when Ethan entered. She stood by the window, arms wrapped around herself, her hair down, auburn strands tangled over her shoulders. She looked smaller in the pale light, as if years of grief and guilt had finally caught up and asked for payment. "I should have stopped it sooner," she whispered without turning. "I saw it coming, but I didn't move fast enough." Ethan didn't respond immediately. He watched Lila sleep, curled against Ranger's flank, one small hand buried in his fur. Monroe sat on the other side, her reading glasses resting atop her head, eyes closed in a quiet moment of peace. "You moved," Ethan finally said. "Maybe not as fast as you wanted, but you did, and that's what matters now." Rachel turned, eyes rimmed red but clearer than before. What happens next? She stays with you, under protective oversight for now. Monroe's making sure no one from the system lays a finger on her without clearance. You'll get support, legal, financial, psychological. It won't be easy, but you're not alone. Rachel's lips trembled. You think I can be her mother again? Ethan looked at her fully. You never stopped. That evening, as the sun dipped low, a small crowd gathered in the Ashford community square. The town hadn't seen something like this in years. News of the arrests had traveled fast, and though most people didn't know the full story, they knew enough. A little girl was safe, a dangerous man was behind bars, and the town's quietest officer had uncovered something bigger than anyone had expected. Mayor Janine Rollins, a woman in her 60s with short silver hair and a firm handshake, stepped up to the portable podium. Her voice rang clear. We're here today, not just to recognize courage, but to remember what it means to stand between darkness and those who cannot stand for themselves. She looked toward Ethan and Ranger, standing just beside the stage. For bravery beyond measure, we honor Officer Ethan Cole and his four-legged partner, Ranger. The crowd applauded, first polite, then thunderous. Ranger, ears perked, tail still, watched as Mayor Rollins stepped down and knelt beside him. She held a small, polished medallion attached to a leather collar tag, etched with the words, Ashford Guardian, Ranger. She placed it around his neck and gave him a gentle pat. He may not know what these words mean, she said, smiling, but we do. Lila, wrapped in a thick red sweater too big for her, stood on tiptoe beside Ethan and pressed a kiss to Ranger's head. You're my hero, she whispered. Ranger barked once, sharp, proud, and clear. The kind of bark that doesn't warn, but promises. The first light over Ashford came not in brilliance, but in gentleness, soft gold rising behind the ridges to the east, melting the last damp traces of the storm that had clung to the town for days. The air was crisp, scented with damp pine, chimney smoke, and the quiet breath of a town exhaling after too long held in. The sidewalks, scrubbed clean by days of rain, gleamed faintly in the sun, and the windows of modest houses glowed like they remembered warmth. Life, it seemed, was stirring again. On the porch of a small rental cottage on Maple Avenue, nothing grand, just 2 bedrooms, a garden patch, and chipped green shutters, stood Officer Ethan Cole. His Navy patrol coat had been replaced with a dark sweater and jeans, and though the badge wasn't pinned to his chest this morning, everything about him still felt like service. His posture had softened, though. The shoulders that once carried silence now seemed lighter, as though something had shifted inside. He held a ceramic mug of black coffee in his hands, steam curling upward into the brisk morning. At his feet lay Ranger, sprawled across the wooden boards like a lion at rest. His black and silver coat shimmered with health, his ears flicking at every bird chirp and distant truck horn. The medallion on his collar, Ashford Guardian, clinked gently when he lifted his head to glance toward the yard. The screen door creaked open. Rachel Moore stepped outside, wrapped in a soft cardigan over a faded yellow shirt. Her auburn hair, once tied in hasty knots, now flowed freely around her shoulders, brushed and still damp from her morning shower. She looked different. Not transformed, not untouched by the past, but healing. There were still fine lines of worry at the corners of her eyes, but now they softened when she smiled. She's up, Rachel said, voice light. Asked if Ranger could walk her to the bus stop. Ethan smiled and took a sip of coffee. Of course she did. A moment passed between them, not romantic, not dramatic, but full of something truer. Respect, shared understanding, survival. Inside, Lila was tugging on a red backpack too big for her shoulders. She wore jeans and a navy coat, her golden curls pulled into uneven pigtails. The bruises had faded, leaving only small traces near her jaw, but the light in her eyes had returned fully. She bounded toward the door, boots thumping, lunchbox swinging from her hand. Ranger, she called, it's time. Ranger rose with a groan that was more theatrical than necessary. He padded beside her, obedient and proud, his head high. Rachel stepped down to kneel beside her daughter. You remember what Ms. Monroe said, right? She asked gently. Lila nodded solemnly. Don't talk to grown-ups I don't know, If anyone tries to pick me up, tell my teacher. Rachel smiled and kissed her on the forehead. That's my girl. They watched as Lila and Ranger headed down the east walk. A few neighbors waved, Mr. Hensley with his dog across the street, Mrs. Nguyen with her flower hose still dripping. Lila waved back shyly, her gloved hand small in the morning air. Ranger walked beside her like a silent guardian, never straying more than a foot. Ethan and Rachel stayed on the porch until the bus pulled up and Lila disappeared inside. I didn't think we'd make it here, Rachel said softly. You did the hardest part, Ethan replied. You stayed. Rachel turned toward him. And you? He exhaled. I think I finally stopped running. From the corner of the street, Dorothy Monroe's car approached. She parked along the curb and stepped out, wearing her usual blazer and flats, a tablet under her arm. She waved, then climbed the steps. You two look rested, she said. Rachel laughed softly. That's because you took my paperwork nightmare off my hands. Monroe smirked. You're welcome, and good news. Lila's guardianship hearing is being expedited. Once she's officially placed back in your care, no one from that system touches her again. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. Thank you. Monroe looked at Ethan. And the Bureau wanted me to pass this along. They're offering you a position, Joint Task Force, Child Protection Enforcement, statewide. Ethan raised an eyebrow. They don't waste time. You don't have to take it, but you made a dent, bigger than you realize. Ethan looked out toward the street. The fog was lifting. Children were laughing on their way to school. The town looked different, not because it had changed, but because something inside him had. I'll think about it, he said. Ranger let out a soft bark, then settled back on the porch, eyes closed in contentment. That afternoon, Ashford's local paper released a front-page article titled, Behind the Badge, the Cop, the Girl, and the Dog that brought Ashford's shadows into the light. It featured a picture, Lila on the front steps of her house, arms thrown around Ranger's thick neck, Ethan and Rachel in the background, smiling. No medals, no headlines shouting glory. Just 3 lives that refused to be broken, and a town that, for the first time in a long time, remembered what hope looked like. Sometimes God doesn't part the sea in front of us. Sometimes he sends a child, a loyal German shepherd, and a quiet officer who refuses to give up. This story reminds us that miracles don't always arrive with lightning and trumpets. They come quietly, in courage, in loyalty, in love that endures through darkness. In your everyday life, maybe you're not chasing criminals or rescuing the forgotten, but every act of kindness, every moment you choose to protect someone weaker, that's a light God can use. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment to let us know where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe to join us for more stories of love, redemption, and light. And if you believe in the power of divine protection, type Amen in the comments. May God bless you and your loved ones, today and always.